welcome back. Alrighty, guys, good to have you back. So, now, but I had the most amazing time a while ago. You would think it was from a high-end restaurant. It really wasn't. It was just perfectly balanced. But, anyways, welcome back to episode 3, everyone. Welcome back. Great to have you. So today we're going to be looking at Ephesians 5. The last time we would have done the proverbial wifey. And so now we're going to take a look at what the ideal husband, the characteristic traits of it should be. Alright, so let's take your time now and look into that. And so we're going to start with, obviously verse 1. But before we start, pray to God that there'll be knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that we garner from this, that you'll also grant it to me as I am operating as your son. Pray, dear God, that as we speak to this trait and this listed, that the men who hear will be transformed, that the men who listen will be improved, that the men who listen will be able to reassess, realign, and if they were focused before, they'll so reassess, refocus, and then they'll realign. All right, that's also the theme for my church at this time. But anyways, here's the pre, guys. We are gonna dive in now. So Ephesians 5. Let's start with verse 1. Verse 1 to 7 really speaks to walking in love. All right. It doesn't necessarily speak to that of the husband, but it speaks to walking in love. Verse 7 to 21 also speaks to walking as children of light. So it gives us on both sides a general, or I wouldn't say general, but it mostly gives us a foundation as to what it means to walk in love. It gives us a foundation as to what it means to be children of light. And then now, what we find that in verse 22 to verse 33 is where the instructions for marriage would really kick in. Well, it's where Paul will start to speak to it. So, in verse 22, as you guys know, I like to read the verse as you do. Verse 22 reads, and this is from the King James Version or KJV's preferred abbreviation. So it says, wives, submit yourselves unto your husband, unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. So in verse 22, it starts with instruction to the wife from a place of responsibility, respect, and accountability. That is the case because it says, as unto the Lord. It is respect and value for your husband, yes. So what really stands out to me is the true accountability system. Not to be for want of a better word, Jamaican police picks up. But what we have heard for generations, that women lack accountability. Right? They don't like to hear that they're wrong. They don't respond very well to hearing that they're wrong, especially from the person who's most intimate to them. And so I find it interesting that verse 22 starts by saying that wives should operate from a place of accountability and respect. And the accountability and respect is even, if we're being honest, to the husband directly. So at the face of it, the husband is who receives it, but when you really look into it, it is really because they are honoring God. It is the respect and love that they have for God that will translate into the respect and love, or the respect and the accountability that the husband will experience. So if you say you love me, or if you say you love me, Lord your God, then you will obey me. Why? Because love for God is measured by Him in obedience. Right? Obedience is seen in the submission. And here the wife is called to submit unto the Lord unwaveringly. reciprocal. That's what we see in verse 22. And in verse 23, we see where the husband. Oh, let me read that. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the savior of the body. Right, in verse 23, the husband being the head of the wife is not a power trip. It's not a I am man, you must do what I say type of situation. That's really that immature man or someone who would have been cultured incorrect faith. And that does happen in different situations, and society does systematically try and teach men to operate like that. But that's not the divine operation of God. And so, as I was saying, it's not a power trip. It really represents accountability for his responsibility to her. It really represents accountability for his responsibility to her. Right? And in verse 24, where it reads, therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. So the wife must honor her husband as unto God. That subject, that submission, if you realize it keeps coming back to a matter of honoring the husband as unto God. So that accountability starts with their relationship with God. And when you find that there is a breakdown in that honor system, it is usually because there's a breakdown in the relationship with God. Alright, and that's just the truth. Everything starts and ends there. Everything starts and ends with the relationship that you have. So, verse 25, which reads, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. If nothing else was said, this could cover it all. This one verse could essentially be all that husbands would need to know how to operate in their marriage. I kid you not. I kid you not. If nothing else was said, this verse, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. This verse, yeah. That one, yeah. This could have been it. Because when you dissect this verse, there's so much to get from it. I said verse. I can put that in. Sorry. But when you dissect this verse, there's so much to get. Right? Because to love like Christ means to live like Christ. The context of this is important. The society Paul lived in did not emphasize on the duties of husbands to wives. That's the reality of the culture back in the day. It was the woman sit down and be quiet type of culture, which is how we perceive it. So Paul, in writing this, already goes against the grain of society. Because he's now saying to me, no man, you guys have to be accountable. That's what he's saying. And especially as a man, he's going against the grain. Co-men. And as a single one at that. That being said, Christ's love is continual, not conditional. Let me go again. Christ's love is continual, not conditional. To love your wife is to love irrespective of, meaning continually, not based on conditions. Movies teach you conditions as to why you should love a particular person. Air quote love. The Word of God teaches the irrespective type of love. The though you are flawed, the though you have things to work on, the though improvements need to be done, the though you rub me the wrong way. The purpose-driven type of love. So, continual, not conditional. With that, we are called, and that calling is a charge, so we're charged, as it is our responsibility, to love her irrespective. Because that is what it means when Jesus lived a life of love, pouring into people who knew not true love, who hated him and despised him out of ignorance. And I'm not saying marry a woman who despises you, because Christ died for those who despised him. Christ lived a life that taught the ignorant of his love and of his Father's love. But the verse says, even as Christ loves the church, that being the body of people, chooses to also live a sacrificial love in honor of him, in obedience and submission. Submission meaning the yielding, which is the giving up of his or her own rights and losing self to another, meaning it's a selfless love. It's not about me, it's about you. Christ was the epitome of selfishness. You got foolishness. Christ was the epitome of selflessness. Cool. Christ was literally the very embodiment of my needs and desires after. Lord, I trust you to have them fulfilled. You get me? Quick break though. Being what I've said so far in mind, this is why it is important to pray as you pursue. Men, this is for you. Because I believe men pursue. Woman allows for the pursuit. Men pursue and women allow for the pursuit. Right? Because discernment is essential throughout the process of seeing who this woman is and seeing who she is. Does she complement your purpose in life? Does she have the same value systems? What does her life of worship look like? Who is God to her? Quick point to note. You can identify where someone is in their walk with the Lord by how they describe it. That is, God referred to as God or him, my father, my friend, my God. It shows personal relationship, intimacy, stage of life in the Christ walk. And these are little things that are indicators of what you as a man are trying to identify. Because it also helps give you insight into a woman's personality type. And this is important. Because the more emotive the description that is of God to them, usually is the more emotive the woman. The more emotive the description is, the more emotive the woman. Less mush is not always a bad thing though. It can speak to a more focused and logical woman, and that's okay, because that can complement some men's purpose, and that's okay. But it does not mean she is not emotive, but how she emotes, meaning her expression of emotion may not be the bubbly sunshine and flowers, rainbows, but it can come across as anything you need and I see, I've got you. Right? Okay. That being said, let's come back from the segue and divert it. So Christ never came to die expecting anything back from us. Say that again. Christ never came to die expecting anything back from us. Christ came to die in honor of his Father, 1. In obedience of his Father's will, 2. And he came to die as an example of the purest, displayed, painful, and intentional love. The purest, displayed, painful, intentional love. So his decision was based on honor, obedience, and action. Of the three, all are directed towards God, and one in particular is for us to note because it will guide how we operate on an interpersonal level. So Christ spoke of love, and did signs of wonders. Then showed in action what that love is. So it is our responsibility to show how much we love her, even more so than to say how much we love her. Note, affirmation is good for the heart, but action is good for the spirit. Let me go again. Affirmation is good for the heart, but action is good for the spirit. Now, verse 26 to 27 reads thus, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word. 27, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. In a sense, Paul explains more fully the results of Christ's atonement for the church, meaning how he makes the church holy and pure. That's what those two verses say. And if we go to 28, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. So ought men to. So ought men to. This phrase, mandem, means in the same way. Right? Therefore, in the same way as Christ's sacrifice created or allowed for that purity, the same value, sacrifice, grit, diligence, discipline, and obedience should be applied to loving his wife, your wife, my wife, the woman we choose to bond with as our wife. She now becomes a part of his, meaning she becomes a part of him, as she was in the beginning. In the beginning, meaning in Genesis, where the rib was taken out. Right? And we're going to touch back on that again in a verse after. But she is his body. Because remember, he was made from Adam. Woman, he was made from Adam. One body, one flesh. Right? That's what we're going for. I'm not sure if that phrase means anything anywhere else. So that's all I'm going to decide in the case. If it means anything else, I don't know anything about it. But verse 29. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. This is further perspective on the oneness or the shift in perspective and operation that we should now have in the honoring, which is loving, of our wives. No one nourishes or feeds what they hate. On average, that's not a thing. Because if you hate it, you want to be separated from it. You don't want to have any part to do with it. That's the average normal behavior, by the way. That's the standard. So no one nourishes and feeds what they hate. The presumption here, though, is that you don't hate yourself, as we're working with that standard that we mentioned before. So as such, you should be taking care of yourself. Now, since you love her as if she was your own self, it means she should be treated the best and taken care of. You get me? Because a point to notice is, if you are treating your wife or wife to be poorly, maybe it's you. Yeah, man, check inside your mind. Maybe it's you. Because it all starts in your mind. How you view yourself, how you believe you should be treated, what you think should be the modus operandi. But if you are treating your wife poorly, or if your wife or your wife to be is being treated poorly, maybe it's the man. Maybe it's just you. Genuinely. Think about it. Honestly and objectively. Think about it. And if she I don't say complains as if to whine, but if she does stop it or complain to you, it might take some time. Reassess. Maybe it really is something that you're doing. Maybe you are viewing yourself in a particular way, or you didn't view a particular thing important for you, and as such, you don't place importance on the operation of that thing in your relationship. But that's what she needs, or that's what she will need. Check it out. Verse 28 to 30. They walk together. So we're going to read those 3 verses. So starting from 28. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Right? Now, in verse 28 to 30, in essence, if you are to love your wife as Christ loved the church, you are required, this means it's not optional, you're required to give up your personal rights for the good of your wife. Note, this is why it's important. And this is why I spend so much time on the proverbial wifey. Because I understand that for men, instinctively, we do this thing where we will serve. And so it's important to know who you are serving. And if they will truly complement you in your purpose in life. Because you can serve the wrong person, and then the fruit is compromised. So, it is a formal, dignified, deeply sincere covenant of love. And here's the thing about a covenant. Covenants are binding, which means there is a religious or legal obligation, or there are religious or legal obligations in a covenant. It is formal, meaning that covenants usually are written, though you do have some oral covenants that exist as well, but covenants usually are written. And it is also reciprocal, meaning both parties have that same obligation, which is or made it binding at the beginning, both parties have obligations to fulfill. It's a mutual agreement. So there must be consensus on what we're both going to do to make this thing fruitful in the end for both of us. Cool? It is also relational, but this is perspective that exists. I want to say generally in the quote unquote secular world that says marriage is just a paper. It is just a contract. And it's not true. Marriage is a covenant. But if we are agreeing that marriage is a covenant, it also means, based on what a covenant is that there's a relational aspect to it. In some way, shape, or form. Which means this establishes relationship between the two parties. There is something that you will do and that we will agree on that will make us both feel satisfied. And that forms a relationship. How deep that relationship goes is entirely up to you. But in the context of a marriage, there should be depth. So we press on to verse 31 to 32. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Interesting. But this alludes to, and allude really means it references or points right back to Genesis 2 verse 24. Right? And in Genesis 2 verse 24, it would really speak to God's initial statement in the scriptures pertaining to marriage. Right? And so it speaks to the sexual union. This is Genesis 2:24. It speaks to the sexual union and the coming together of both fleshes to allow for spiritual, mental, and emotional harmony. Now, guys, harmony. So, Ephesians 5:31, it speaks to that. Right? It's an allusion to Genesis 2 verse 24, which really speaks to that sexual union, which to the sexual union. It facilitates that harmony. Something that I found interesting though is this sync, which is the harmonizing. It takes place through sex and repetition of life together, just you two as one. So you may want to be careful before you're having sex with. Yes. But it's interesting how originally it was built to facilitate the harmonizing of souls. Now it is referred to as soul ties outside of marriage. Never met that? Yeah, no, it's crazy. When I was doing this today, I was like, oh, that's wild. It really was for harmonizing. But then it looks like it, but does a different thing. So the binding still takes place, but the fruit of the binding, the nature of the binding, the nature of the binding is not the nature of God. And because the nature of the binding is not the nature of God, that's an issue and becomes a tie. But true love is evidenced by that oneness. That is the fruit spiritually, and by their fruits you shall know them. Meaning the oneness that we're speaking of is the fruit of the marriage. It's the fruit of the union. We're not talking about the fruit in terms of children and not that aspect of it, but the oneness. You look at your relationship with God, that sync, that oneness you have with the spirits. That's the fruit of your relationship with God. If you look in your marriage, that oneness is the fruit of true love. And that is why marriages are tempted to be sold on media or in media by showcasing a sick of some form based on their target audience. You get me? If the aim of the movie is to appeal to the intellectual crowd, then what it means is you're gonna have a couple who is just brilliant, but that's a form of oneness that they're trying to set. And then in verse 33 it reads, "Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." Let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. This was beautiful. This tied it all together, and it shows the flow. Because what it means is, let the husband's Christ-like love and the wife's reverence, meaning respect, be the two binding obligations that will birth the true divine love that God created and we seek out. Listen, guys, this isn't complicated. I kid you not, it's not complicated. It's not. I believe we make it complicated. And I believe the enemy tries to confuse us. But it's not a complicated thing. I genuinely don't think it is. And so I believe what we need to do, one, seek ye first the kingdom of God, so that all things will be added unto you. Man named Blood for discernment. Pay attention to what is happening around. We use wisdom in your conversations, calculations, selections. And women do the same thing, except bear in mind that who he is, you will have to become one with. And is that someone that you would like to become? Because you will bear his seed, not just his children, but who he is. You will be. It's not that you lose your identity, but to become one means that there will be a binding, a harmonizing. And with that said, guys, this is the end of our podcast for today. D.I.V.E out.